Friends, I'd like to speak about my experience as a Christian reading the Qur'an this evening, but I'd also like to speak about a particular question about the Qur'an, which has to do with the fear of God and divine mercy. And hopefully it will become clear by the end how the two things go together. And I'll start with a little reflection about teaching the Qur'an in a Catholic university. I teach at the University of Notre, but in the proper American pronunciation is Notre Dame. So, and we have a largely Catholic student body, and so when I teach classes on the Qur'an, principally I'm teaching to Christians. And in that context, I find that not infrequently, my students in reading the Qur'an will express a sort of dismay with what they read of the God of the Qur'an. In particular, they don't seem to like the stories in the Qur'an of God destroying nations of unbelievers. On an online forum that we have for our class, which is meant to encourage sort of participation and discussion outside of class, one student this semester wrote, quote, "Clearly justice is an incredibly important theme in the Qur'an, but reading the Qur'an for the first time brought more fear than anything else." Other students wonder how the stories of divine punishment in the Qur'an, I don't know if it's clear what I mean yet, we'll get into it, but of course the Qur'an has these stories in which a prophet is sent to an unbelieving people, the people refuse to believe, and God destroys the people. Yeah, so some students wonder how these stories of divine punishment go together with the frequent description in the Qur'an of God as merciful and compassionate. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. We have this refrain at the beginning of the surahs, and then frequently these divine epithets of God being merciful and compassionate. Some might say that in the punishment stories, God seems not to be the merciful, but the merciless. One student wrote, quote, this is back to my online forum, "The God of the Qur'an puzzles me. He seems like a paradox. On the one hand, we've read many punishment stories about the worse than unfortunate fates that will befall anyone who chooses not to believe. The Qur'an tells us that those people will suffer for the choice to turn away from God. At the same time, however, the Qur'an also asserts that God is merciful and forgiving." So do we have a real paradox here in reading the Qur'an between the mercy of God and the justice of God? I guess that's the question about the Qur'an I'd like to ask. Other students, my Christian students, sometimes suggest that the things that the God of the Qur'an does is nothing that their God would do. Their God is a loving Father. He would not destroy to the very last those who reject God's signs, as the God of the Qur'an does, or seize a nation by an earthquake, or rain down on them a shower of stones. To this end, another student wrote on our class forum, quote, "The seemingly chaotic way with which the Qur'an weaves its picture of God creates a sense of imbalance, of unease in me. But is that perhaps the point? This God speaks as he wills. His concessions to human believers are extraordinary, but his treatment of unbelievers, of which I, reading the text, am often reminded I belong, is terrible. I am so constantly wondering as I find myself entranced by this text in a world that seems both familiar yet foreign. Is this the same God that I call Father?" To such students, the first thing I point out, of course, is that the Quranic stories of divine punishment are closely related to the stories of divine punishment in their own Old Testament. In the Old Testament, when God saw, quote, that human wickedness was great on earth, he didn't give humans a great big hug, but rather he drowned them in the flood. When he saw that, quote, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was so great and their sin so grave, he did not smile down at them from heaven. Instead, he, quote, rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire of his own sending. True, God was willing to listen to Abraham before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham sought to convince him not to destroy these cities. But after listening politely and, we must say, patiently, God destroyed Sodom anyway. And for what it's worth, by the way, the Qur'an also has a reference to the discussion in chapter 11, the discussion between Abraham and God, before the destruction of Lot's people, or before the destruction of Sodom. Thus, the problem of divine destruction obtains not only in regard to the Qur'an, but also in regard to the Christians' Old Testament. Yet it comes, and maybe the New Testament too, but I would focus on the Old Testament because it's a bit easier. Yet when it comes to the Old Testaments, Christians tend not to have a problem. I suspect this is largely because many Christians don't read the Old Testament at all, and therefore the problem goes away. That's one strategy. And many who do read the Old Testament adopt the heresy of Marcion. The heresiarch who insisted that there are two gods, the evil creator God of the Old Testament and the good spiritual God, Christ, of the New. Thus, it's not uncommon to hear Christians, for example, say things like, I don't really like the God of the Old Testament. I prefer the God of the New Testament. He's much nicer. But then my talk tonight is not meant to declare most Christians heretics, or at least not only to declare most Christians heretics. My goal instead is to discuss this apparent paradox, as I will argue it is, of the God in the Qur'an, the God who is vengeful and merciful, the God whom the Qur'an calls Dhul Intiqam, the one who possesses revenge or vengeance, and Rahman Rahim. One of the most dramatic juxtapositions of these two qualities is in the 7th chapter of the Qur'an, in verse 156, where the Qur'an has God say, عَذَابِ أُصِيبُ بِهِ مَنْ أَشَاءُ وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِّعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. As for my punishment, I strike whomever I will with it, but my mercy encompasses all things. Now, the question of God's nature in the Qur'an is of personal interest to me, inasmuch as I am a Christian scholar of Islam. Or perhaps it is better to say that I am a scholar of Islam and the Qur'an in particular, who happens to be a Christian. I am not a Christian theologian, so don't expect anything really profound tonight. Of course, I am pretty good at accusing other Christians of heresy. I specialize in that as well. But I don't mean to make any theological propositions in this talk. I will not, for example, ask whether and how Christians can conceive of the Qur'an as having a place in their history of revelation. But I am a Christian after all, and this does make me different from other scholars of the Qur'an. My secular colleagues who study the Qur'an need not find any problem at all, for example, with the stories of divine punishment. They might explain these stories simply as elements of the Qur'an's religious exhortation, and they need not ask the question of how these stories relate to the Qur'an's insistence that God is also merciful and compassionate. Now, in theory, a Christian scholar of the Qur'an might also ignore the question, but in fact, this is difficult to do. By virtue of their belief in God, Christians have a particular interest in the way in which texts, and not only the Bible, but any text, presents God and speaks of God. They're inevitably interested in how the presentation of God in other texts compares to their own. And they ask the question of whether that presentation might teach them something useful about God. When it comes to the Qur'an, and in a special way, when it comes to the punishment stories of the Qur'an, I believe that there is indeed something useful to be learned about God. And that is the lesson that I'd like to discuss tonight. And so after this long and tortuous introduction out of the way, we can finally get to business. I'll proceed with this discussion in 3 steps. First, a brief presentation of the punishment stories of the Qur'an. Second, a reflection on hell in the Qur'an. There'll be some heaven as well, but mostly hell. And finally, a reflection on divine blessing in the Qur'an. So we start with the punishment stories. The phrase punishment stories, by the way, is a label used to describe a collection of narratives in the Qur'an which all end up with God destroying the unbelievers. These stories involve a number of characters from the Bible, including Noah, Lot, and Moses. In the Qur'an, however, these figures are quite different from the biblical counterparts. They are all divine messengers or prophets sent by God to warn their peoples of destruction. They exhort their people to believe in God and simultaneously to affirm that they, that is, the prophetic figure, are messengers sent by God. And they warn their peoples that failure to do so, to recognize both God and the messenger, both are needed, not just one, you need both, that the failure to recognize these two things will bring down God's wrath upon them. And inevitably, in these narratives, the people fail to believe in God or to recognize the messenger, one or the other or both, and are consequently destroyed. Now, the bit about the presence of biblical characters in these punishment stories is interesting because the biblical characters indeed retain some of their characteristics in the Qur'an. The Qur'an does not, for example, have the people of Noah destroyed by fire and not a flood. It does not have the people of Lot destroyed by water instead of fire. And it does not have Pharaoh and his chariots cast into the desert instead of thrown into the sea. Yet we might say that the role of biblical narratives in shaping the Quranic punishment stories is ornamental. The Qur'an uses certain distinctive features of these biblical narratives, perhaps because they were so well known that the Qur'an could not do otherwise. However, those biblical narratives themselves are completely transformed to fit the standard model of these punishment stories. For the Qur'an is concerned with making a religious argument to the people of its own time by asking the question, Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt? Where have those who were before us gone? It is not concerned with teaching its audience how the stories of Noah or Lot or Moses fit into a grand historical narrative. This means, incidentally, that it is a real question, not our question tonight, but nevertheless a real question, whether figures such as Noah, Lot, and Moses are shared by Islam and Christianity and Judaism, or whether, in fact, the figures are totally different and only happen to share the same name. In any case, precisely because the Qur'an does not fit these biblical characters into a grand historical narrative, it is able to integrate in the midst of narratives about biblical characters, narratives about characters unknown to the Bible with names such as Hud, Salih, and Shu'aib. These characters too are poured into the same prophetic mold. All of these stories, whether they involve biblical or non-biblical characters, whether they involve Moses or Shu'aib, they involve the same scenario, and we might review this here. In 4 steps, I think, we can describe the narrative which is often described as the punishment story in the Qur'an. The first is the call of the prophet. Here I've taken as an example Qur'an 7. There are 3 different Quranic chapters which present a series of punishment stories. They appear elsewhere as well. 7, 11, and 26 is where they appear sort of in parallel format. And we can see the similarity of each of these accounts. So the first of these is Noah. We sent Noah to his people. And then 6 verses later, Hud, and we sent Hud, their brother, to the people of Ad. Several verses later, Salih, we sent to Thamud, their brother Salih. 7 verses later, and we sent Lot. Then we sent to Midian, their brother Shu'aib. And then finally Moses, who sent to Pharaoh and his nobles. The second stop is the preaching of the prophet to his people. I won't read through these all, you can follow them yourselves. But in each case, after describing the way in which God sends the prophet, the Qur'an then describes the preaching of the prophet. And the preaching doesn't change, that's the key point. It's not affected by historical context. It's not affected by the place or the time in which the prophet's people lived. The preaching is global and universal and eternal. Noah said, O people, worship God, you have no other God but He. Hud said, ignore this backwards bracket, that was some diabolical interference. O you people, worship God, for you have no other God but He. Salih said, O you people, worship God, you have no other God but He. Lot said to his people, and here we have a variation which reflects, I think, the biblical narrative. Why do you commit this lecherous act which none in the world has committed before? Shu'aib will sound familiar again. O you people, worship God, for you have no other God but He. The second step then, the prophet preaches to his people. The third step, the people respond. The Prophet debates with his people. So the Qur'an gives us what we might call the counter discourse, both the preaching of the believing Prophet and the response of the unbelieving people. For example, it quotes the elders of Noah's people, who replied, "We see clearly that you have gone astray." Noah responds, "I have not gone astray, but have been sent by my Lord, the creator of the worlds." Similarly, in the Hud story, the chiefs of Hud's people replied, "We find you full of folly and a liar to boot." The Salih story has a wrinkle in it because Salih, like Moses, brings to his people a sign, a reason to believe in the truth of the message which he's preaching. In Moses' story, like in the biblical story, you might remember the signs that he brings to Pharaoh is the staff, which transforms into a serpent, and his hand, which he is transformed when he pulls it out and then returned to health. In the story of Salih, he brings some sort of miraculous animal, a she-camel. Even with this sign from God, the people don't accept. "Bring, O Salih." They challenge him, they boast to him, they mock him. "Bring, O Salih, on us the affliction you promise, if you are indeed one of the sent ones." And you can read through the rest. The fourth step, God destroys the unbelievers. Here we find a certain parallel in that all of the unbelievers are destroyed. They're destroyed, however, in different ways through natural catastrophes. The destructions of Noah and Lot in Moses are shaped by the biblical stories. This is what I meant by the biblical stories have this ornamental effect. So the people of Noah are killed by a flood, the people of Lot from brimstone raining down from heaven, and the people of Moses, if we can call that way, namely Pharaoh, are destroyed, well, first afflicted by the plagues and then destroyed in the flood. The way in which the Qur'an tells these punishment stories, these stories of warning, disbelief, and destruction, one after another, tells us something about the fundamental concern of the Qur'an. The Qur'an seeks to warn its own audience, and thereby to convince them to believe in their God and in their messenger, Muhammad. Thus we might say that in the Qur'an, the prophets of the past are prophets of the present. All of the prophets are reflections of the Qur'an's efforts to convince its own audience to believe now. The point of these stories, of course, is that by hearing these terrible stories of destruction, the Qur'an's audience will make a better choice than those who chose not to believe. For example, the people of Salih, who mocked him and challenged him to bring on the destruction. By telling these stories, the Quran says, think about this. Are you going to challenge this prophet? Are you going to reject this prophet? Or are you going to make a better decision? Still, it would be simplistic to conclude that the Quran uses these stories as a way of presenting merely bad examples, as a teacher might do with a kid who's caught chewing gum in class, by making him sit in the corner, or I don't know what you do in the UK with a naughty kid in class. In the US, they used to make them wear this pointy hat, a dunce cap. When my students were in school in Lebanon, they would still smack them on the hand with a ruler. The point of smacking someone on the hand or the ruler is that everyone else sees it and they don't chew gum. Otherwise, you may have an entire class chewing gum. The Qur'an's punishment stories aren't that simple. It's not merely a case of presenting bad examples, because, in fact, the prophets in the punishment stories do not simply warn the people of destruction. They also remind people of what God has done for them. Here I've titled this, Ubi sunt, this theme of where are those who were before us gone, as a divine sign, or an evidence, a piece of evidence or a proof that should convince you to believe in God. And we find this trend, this sort of thread that's woven through these narratives in which the prophets don't merely predict destruction, but they say to their people, think of the way that God has chosen you. Remember your blessings that God has chosen you in the place of peoples before you. So, for example, Hud, after the people of Noah are destroyed, says, do you wonder that a warning has come to you from your Lord through a man who is one of you? Remember, he made you leaders after the people of Noah. So think of the favors of God. And then, after the people don't think of the favors of God and are destroyed, the people of Salih says to his people, Thamud, he says, remember the people of Hud, whose name are Ad. I hope all these names are not completely confusing. Remember how you were made leaders after the people of Ad. Think of that, reflect on that, and then later on. So think of the favors of God. Later on, Shu'aib gives a long list of the peoples who have been destroyed before and asks his people to reflect on this. This is the third passage here. This is from Shu'aib now. O my people, I fear lest your opposition to me should bring you the like of what befell the people of Noah, or Hud, or Salih, and the people of Lot are not distant from them. Beg your Lord to forgive you, and turn to him. Indeed, my Lord is compassionate and loving. A beautiful passage, I think. Thus, the message of the prophets is not meant simply to provoke fear. It is meant to provoke fear. Of course, the mere mention of Noah's people should terrify the people of Hud, and the mere mention of Hud's people should terrify the people of Salih, perhaps in the same way that the mere mention of the Holocaust to us should provoke fear. Yet the interesting point of these passages is that the message of the prophets is also meant to provoke gratitude. Fear and gratitude are not opposites to the Qur'an, they are twins. We might note here in this passage the way the Qur'an, I wonder if I have, I do, I have the power. The way the Qur'an says, has Shu'aib, just after threatening them with punishment by mentioning the destruction of earlier peoples, then mentions, indeed my Lord is compassionate and loving. Be grateful to God for the place you've been given, but fear God as well. Yet the point of all of this for the Qur'an is not to teach a history lesson, but rather to say something about its own prophet. Just as Hud, Salih, and Shu'aib pointed to the fate of earlier peoples, so the Qur'an's prophet, in preaching in this way, is doing the same thing. Muhammad, we might say, is the latest of the prophets of the punishment stories. By preaching these stories, it is as though the Qur'an has Muhammad somewhere down here in the bottom, as though he were saying, O my people, I fear lest your opposition to me should bring you the like of what befell the people of Noah, or Hud, or Lot, or Salih, or Shu'aib. In this light, we can understand the reason why the Qur'an so often refers to its own prophet as a warner, or nadhir in Arabic, a term which appears often in the Qur'an. For example, in Surah 2. And we have sent you with the truth to give glad tidings and to warn. Or in Surah 5, Al-Ma'idah, O you people of the book, our apostle has come to you. Apostle here is a translation of Rasul, one who is sent. Has come to you when apostles had ceased to come long ago, lest you said, there did not come to us any messenger of good news or of warnings. So now there has reached you a bearer of good tidings and of warnings. Or Surah 7, Al-Araf. Have they not bethought themselves their companion is not mad? He is only a plain admonisher. Well, it's warner, it's the same word in Arabic, Nadhir. And I note there are merely 41 other verses which speak of the Prophet as a warner. Well, we can move on to the second topic, and it's much shorter, as is the third, I promise, so I won't keep you here forever, and I think I'll stick to my allotted time. As for Muhammad's preaching, if I would suggest he is the latest of the prophets of the punishment stories, we might also suggest that the punishment which he is threatening comes with a blessing. Because the punishment he's threatening is not destruction by a natural catastrophe, it's not a flood, it's not an earthquake, it's not fire from heaven, but instead it's the punishment of the next world. And of course he presents also the prospects of the reward of the next world in the heavenly garden. The connection between the punishments of this world, which befell the unbelievers of the past, and the punishments of the next world, which threatens the unbelievers of today, or of the Prophet's time, Prophet Muhammad's time, is seen in a passage in Quran 11. Surah Hud. After telling the stories of the punishment of earlier peoples, the Qur'an declares, we did not wrong them, they wronged themselves. And we have this reflection first on the punishment stories that took place, or that were retold in the surah, and then a transition beginning in verse 102, 103, and this surely is a sign for him who fears the torment of the hereafter. That is, the destruction by natural catastrophe in this world is a sign for he who fears a catastrophe in the next world, that is the punishments of hell. And when we have an allusion to it, hereafter, the day when mankind will all be assembled together, which will be a day when all things would become evident, we are deferring it only for a time ordained. The day it comes, no soul will dare say a word but by his leave, and some will be wretched, and some will be blessed. Hence comes the Qur'an's remarkable interest in hell. Hell is to Muhammad what the flood was to Noah. Hell is the disaster which the Qur'an's prophet is predicting in order to convince his audience, and in order to convince his audience to take this prediction seriously, he makes hell seem as terrible as possible. And so a reader might look at the Qur'an's description of hell and say, well, this is rather dreary, but that's the point. The point is that the prophet is a warner, and the more dramatic the warning is, the more likely his audience is going to listen. We read, for example, in Surah 50, one of the shorter surahs towards the end of the Qur'an, this description of the inevitability of the judgment and the way in which God records everything. Don't think you can hide your sins. The palsy of death will surely come. Verse 21, each soul will come with a driver and a witness, and the driver will say, generally interpreted as an angel of punishment or of judgment, you are oblivious of this, so we have removed the veil, and how keen is your sight today? And his companion, that is another angel, probably, or demon, will say, here is the record of all the bad things that I did. I have ready with me. Cast each stubborn unbeliever into hell. In the next passage here, from a couple surahs later, 56, we then have a description of what hell will be like. But those of the left hand, how unhappy those of the left hand, will be in the scorching wind and boiling water, under the shadow of thick black smoke, neither cool nor agreeable. They were endowed with good things in this life, but persisted in that greater sin, and said, what? When we are dead and turned to dust and bone, shall we then be raised again? Will there be a resurrection? And so will our fathers say, indeed, the early and later generation, etc. Verse 51, then you, the erring and the deniers, will eat of the tree of Zaqum. A reference which elsewhere the Qur'an describes as a tree which has fruit that is like the head of demons, and drink over it scalding water, lapping it up like female camels, raging of thirst with disease. Such will be their welcome on the day of judgment. Just to sort of give you an illustration of the Qur'an's presentation of hell, I've included one medieval portrayal of it. Here we have the tree of Zaqum and two demons there in the bodies of those being tortured in hell, sort of dangling around. One is about to be eaten or attacked by some sort of ghoulish creature down from the bottom. All of this, of course, seems rather gruesome. But in reading the material about hell in the Qur'an, one notices an interesting feature, namely that descriptions of the day of judgment and of the suffering of the unbelievers in hell tend to be preceded by descriptions of the blessings which God has given to humanity. For example, a couple of slides ago, I shared with you a passage on the day of doom. Here it is again. But remember this, the palsy of death will surely come, etc. But what I didn't share with you is what this is preceded by. The Qur'an introduces this sort of terrifying passage by reminding its audience of the blessings which humans have already received in this world. So here we have Qur'an chapter 50, verse 19, and here chapter 50, the passage before it, beginning of verse 6, where the Qur'an here doesn't mean to terrify its audience at all, but means to speak to its audience's conscience. Have you not pondered? Have you not thought of the blessings which God has already given you? And this is why very often some people say the proper translation of the word in the Qur'an that is often used to mean unbelief or disbelief is actually ingratitude. This word kufr in the Qur'an is actually ingratitude. To be an unbeliever means to deny the blessings which God has given you. And one recent translation of the Qur'an speaks of the kuffar, those guilty of kufr, as the scoffers, those who scoff at the divine messengers and at the blessings which God has given them. And here we have a beautiful passage reflecting on nature, God as creator, a passage which might make us think of some passages of the book of Job or of the Psalms. Have they not looked at the sky above them, how we have fashioned and adorned it, and it has no flaw? We stretched the earth and placed in it firm stabilizers, and we made every kind of splendid thing to grow upon it, as instruction or reminder to every penitent creature. And we send down water as a blessing from the sky, and grow gardens and tall date palms. And then finally in verse 11, the Qur'an tells us that God has even given you in nature a sign that gives you a specific indication of how the resurrection of the body will be as a provision for men, and we've enlivened a region that was dead. Even thus will be the life after death. That is, imagine a desert scene in the Middle East, which when the fall rains come, suddenly sprouts with green. This will be the resurrection. Quran then gives us a sort of metaphor for the way the resurrection of the body will take place. Still more remarkable is a passage from the following surah. This is surah 50 from the following surah, 51, which first refers to the punishments of hell, and then to the reward of heaven, and then continues with the reflection on the blessings of this world. So first we have this message, when is the day of judgment, the day that will be burnt in the fire? But this is paired with a mention of divine blessing. Verse 15, surely those who fear God and follow the straight path will be amidst gardens and fresh springs of water. And then we return by the end of this to a mention again of the blessings of this world. The very last verse in this excerpt, verse 22. There is in the heavens your sustenance in whatever has been promised to you. Thus we might say that the Qur'an, in telling the punishment stories, the point is not only to connect it with gory descriptions of hell. There is a connection there. Muhammad, I submit, is the last of the prophets of the punishment stories. Hell is the catastrophe which he predicts. But it's not only connected to that. It's connected with also the descriptions of the pleasures of heaven. So Muhammad is both Nazir and Bashir, both a warner and a giver of good news. And it's also connected with an appeal to humanity's conscience, by reflecting on the blessings which God has already given to humans in this world. Not only are humans called to think of their own future, whether they will prosper or suffer in the afterlife, but also to reflect on their past, what God has given to them and what their proper response should be. The Qur'an combines these various topics to make an argument about why one should believe. And it is this argument making, now we're finally getting to the point. It is this argument making, it seems to me, that is the key to understanding the Qur'an's description of God as merciful and benevolent. The mercy of God does not lie in how he deals with unbelievers. The mercy of God lies in the time he takes to make an argument to convince us to believe. It lies in the efforts that he has made time and again to send warners to earth. The Quran tells us, لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ. Every people has had a messenger. It's in this sending of messengers who don't simply come and half-heartedly warn the people of God's wrath, but wholeheartedly speak of the impending punishment to save their people. In this way, we might think of the argument making of the Quran itself as a mercy or an act of compassion. It teaches us to fear God, and the fear of God might save us from eating of the tree of Zaqum, which we saw presented before us. Perhaps in this regard, and I'm getting to the conclusion here, I promise, Christians might think of the Quran in light of the story of the prophet Jonah in the Bible. In this story, the God of the Bible, who after all is the God whom Christians love, still their father, according to Christian readings of the Bible, is ready to destroy Nineveh. He sends Jonah to announce their impending doom. Go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to them that their wickedness has forced itself upon me. And when Jonah finally gets to Nineveh, after that rather embarrassing incident with the fish and being swallowed alive, when Jonah finally gets to Nineveh and proclaims this message, the people of Nineveh repent. Quote, this is Jonah 3:10, God saw their efforts to renounce their evil ways, and God relented about the disaster which he had threatened to bring on them, and did not bring it. This, of course, infuriates Jonah, who was really hoping that the Ninevites would all be destroyed. So we read Jonah's response. Please, God, isn't this what I said would happen when I was still in my own country? This was why I first tried to flee to Tarshish. This means not that he wasn't upset that they were punished. He was upset because they're not punished. Since I knew you were a tender, compassionate God, slow to anger, rich in faithful love, who relents about inflicting disaster. But we might say, God only relented because the people of Nineveh repented. From this we might conclude that the God of Jonah is tender and compassionate in the way the God of the Qur'an is merciful and compassionate. Like the God of Jonah, the God of the Qur'an sends a messenger, a warner to humans who have gone astray before he carries out a punishment upon them. He didn't have to do that. He could have noted their unbelief and simply destroyed them with no warning or no message. And we might remember that in the Jonah story, what saved the life of the Ninevites was their fear of God. It was the fear and terror of God that led the king of Nineveh to put on sackcloth and to order all of his people to do the same. And if I'm not mistaken, I think all the animals too have to put on sackcloth. It was this fearful repentance that saved them. As a Christian, this encounter with God in the Qur'an, as in the book of Jonah, this encounter with a God who is to be feared, is a reminder of the seriousness with which I am to live out my own religious life. If God's compassion lies above all in the act of warning, then we should take that warning seriously. We should not act like the people of Salih, who challenged him to bring on the promised divine punishment. We should fear God, and our fear of God should lead us to holiness. This fear of God should lead us to be courageous in our faith in the midst of a secular world, for example. In the Gospel of Matthew, the Lord tells us, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. The Qur'an reminds us to take such things seriously. In the Qur'an, the people of Hud, before they were destroyed, did not take the prophet seriously. We find you full of folly and a liar to boot, they told him. Is this not a temptation that faces Christians, perhaps especially in our contemporary world? Do we not hear voices which tell us that our faith is ridiculous, full of folly, or a lie? Do we not hear voices that tell us that the promises which God has made to us are not to be believed? We then, one might say, are faced with the same decision that faced the people of Hud. Which voice will we listen to? That of our unbelieving people or that of God? Thank you.